Magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldelder.com. I'm Brent and this is the unit focus video on D cannons, kind of on support weapons, but really, let's be honest, mostly on D cannons, because if you were taking any support weapons in your list, you are probably going to want to outfit them with D cannons. It's by far the most competitive pick. But for you contrary autarchs who like to be different, whose favorite Ninja Turtle was Donatello, I will talk a little bit about those other options later in the video. In these unit focus videos, I talk about what the unit is, its role on the table, obstacles to using it effectively, and how to play around those obstacles. So what's a support weapon? Well, in an Aeldari list, a support weapon is an artillery piece outfitted with one of three options. A D cannon, the one that we'll talk a great deal about, which is a powerful Xenos warp weapon that tears holes in real space and sucks targets into the warp. In early editions of the game, back in 2nd Ed, if you hit something with one of these things, it's just like on either a 3-up or a 4-up. I think it was a 3-up, just killed it regardless of armor saves or remaining wounds, just because it sucks you into the warp. Way back when RPG was basic, or excuse me, 40K was basically an RPG rather than a tactical war game. The Shadow Weaver, like the D cannon, is an indirect fire weapon, but the Shadow Weaver is an anti-infantry weapon geared towards taking out hordes and squads. And then there's the Vibro Cannon, which used to, I guess, combine well with other Vibro Cannons to vibrate stuff and blow it up more easily, but now just is kind of bad. In terms of the role on the table, support weapons they're target elimination weapons. They do have a control power. Anything hit by one of these weapons, well, a unit hit by one of these weapons is suppressed, and is it -1 to hit in your opponent's shooting phase if it's not a monster or a vehicle, which is not nothing, but like not the reason that you take the support weapon. They are for target elimination. And the big difference between, say, a D cannon and a fire prism, right? The tank for target elimination is A points, right? Because the support weapons come in at 125 points instead of significantly more than that. And then typically, at least with the D cannon build, you sort of have similar target elimination power to what you would have if you instead took a fire prism, but you're giving up durability and mobility. You're getting indirect fire, but there's a sacrifice, but it's fewer points. And then the Night Spinner is somewhat comparable to the Shadow Weaver. It's a similar trade-off, except the Shadow Weaver also only does 1 damage instead of 2 damage. It's like much worse than the Night Spinner version of the weapon, which is one of the reasons that Shadow Weavers really just don't see play. So assuming you're taking the D cannon specifically, I'll talk a little bit more about this. The D cannon has a 24-inch range, fires D3 shots, hitting on 3s, strength 16, -4 AP, D6 + 2, blast, devastating wounds, heavy, which is great because it means if you don't move, you get +1 to hit, which cancels the penalty for firing an indirect fire weapon, because this is also an indirect fire weapon. Now, for you players who are new and don't know, an indirect fire weapon, yes, it can target things completely out of line of sight, but anything targeted by an indirect fire weapon automatically gets the benefit of cover if it is in fact indirect. It doesn't get the benefit of cover if you can in fact see the target. But if you're using indirect fire to target something, you're at -1 to hit and the target automatically gets cover. So having the heavy keyword also is good because it just cancels out the indirect fire penalty. So if a D cannon has a line of sight on something, if it has a bead on something, it's going to hit on 2s. And if it doesn't, it's going to hit on, if it doesn't move. And if it doesn't move and it's shooting indirect, it's still hitting on 3s. Now, Strength 16 minus 4d6 plus 2 devastating wounds is an absolutely nuts amount of damage, especially for an indirect fire weapon that can still hit on 3s. And the fact that it has the minus 4 AP means that even if something does get the benefit of cover, it still hits just as hard as a Bright Lance, which only has an AP of minus 3. So one way to think of the D-Cannon, and kind of the most traditional way to think about the D-Cannon, is like an alternative to a bully unit, or like a midfield shooting bully unit. Now, a bully unit is generally a big durable unit that plays in the midfield that your opponent doesn't want to get close to. The D-Cannon has the advantage of being able to sit completely out of line of sight and while being a really good reason for your opponent not to move anything she needs into the midfield, because it just has crazy target elimination power. Especially because with our current detachment bonus, right, we get 1 free reroll to hit and 1 free reroll to wound. So D3 shots, not crazy good, but okay. And if you're rerolling one of those hits and rerolling one of those wounds, well, that also helps to cancel out the penalty for indirect fire. That's a pretty reliable indirect fire weapon. And if you have 2 of these things or 3 of these things, and in general, I think the D-Cannon is an interesting unit in that you really can take 1 or 2 or 3 and have it just make sense in a competitive list. Currently, I think there's a very good argument for 3. I don't think it's an auto-include, but I think there's a very good argument for 3, and that is because of the meta and the rise of Necrons. I'll talk about that in a bit. But traditionally, the way a D-Cannon is used is as this deterrent bully unit. If you are a LATOC player, I think that at some point I'll make a video on running a LATOC, but a LATOC is this like ambushy, shooty, snipey attrition build. And if you're running a LATOC and you don't want to run a bully unit, because there's just something about having the Avatar of Cain charging into somebody's face, or a big block of Wraithguard that isn't really obviously a LATOC has an Avatar and they have Wraith units, but it doesn't have that LATOC vibe, right? So the D-Cannon is cool because it is this like ambushy, hard hitting shooting weapon. So one way that you can use D-Cannons, if you have 2 or 3 of them, is the way that you would use a bully unit to like keep your opponent at bay, try to keep them out of the midfield, make it hard to score midfield objectives, because if anything particularly durable moves on to 1, you just light it up with either 2 or 3 D3, strength 16 minus 4 D6 plus 2. Blast too is cool because it's actually pretty effective against a squad of heavy infantry, a squad of Terminators, or in a mirror match, a squad of Wraithguard. D3 plus 1 shots against the undamaged squad isn't halfway bad when you're going to wound it on 2s and blow through the armor on just about anything but a 6. Well, if you have direct line of sight, I guess anything but a 6. Otherwise, it's going to be a 5. And your opponent certainly doesn't want to expose anything especially durable. And even things with invuln saves, one of the really nice things about the D-Cannon that's an advantage over both the Bright Lance and the Prism Cannon is that devastating wounds keyword. So I mentioned in my last video on fire prisms that they sometimes struggle into stuff with a good invuln save. Well, if you've got devastating wounds on there, you have 2 options where fate dice are concerned. One option is to blow, so you fire D3 shots, right? Typically you're going to fire 2. And with a reroll to hit, you're generally going to hit with both. And at strength 16, with a reroll to wound, you're often going to wound with both. And then you can, of course, roll to wound. And then if you don't get what you want, you use a fate die and set one of the wounds to a 6 automatically, and just automatically do D6 plus 2 regardless of an invuln save, and then the other shot either goes through or it doesn't. And that's just with one of the D-Cannons. If you have 2 or 3 of these things, they just hit absolutely monstrously hard. And then against something that doesn't have an invuln save, where you're not worried about doing the devastating wounds, you do what you would do with a Bright Lance, and you save your fate die to guarantee that you do 8 damage. This is, by the way, a reason that you definitely want a Farseer near at least one of your platforms. And generally they have nice synergy with the Farseer, because the foot Farseer kind of wants to hang back, be out of line of sight, and on your half of the table, maybe legit in your just backfield, and that's kind of where the D cannon wants to be too. Probably, I'm going to talk about an alternative to that play style, but so the ability to simply use a fate die that was a 1 or a 2 to either push through devastating wounds with one of these shots or guarantee that you do 8 damage. That's a really powerful, useful tool. And on a unit that's only 125 points, that's pretty awesome. So if you aren't running Wraithguard or you're not running the Avatar, you need something that keeps your opponent from getting too aggressive, and a bunch of D cannons can do that for you. That said, that's not actually the way the D cannon is being used predominantly in the lists where it's been showing up a bit at GTs since the data slate dropped. Because the other thing you can do with the D cannon is get kind of aggressive with it. And in order to explain this, I'm going to jump ahead to obstacles to playing effectively with it for a moment, because to some degree what you're doing when you use this slightly different playstyle for the D cannon is just to play around one of its limitations, and that is that it has a 24-inch range. The D cannon is very, very powerful shooting, but it's fragile. Toughness 6, 5 wounds, 4-up save. I mean, the 4-up save in particular, like, it's pretty good against small arms fire that's going to struggle to wound it, but a single shot from an enemy heavy weapon can take it out. 2 hits should, and it's likely to have no armor save against a particularly hard-hitting weapon. So it really doesn't want to be exposed to enemy fire, and that 24-inch range is such that if it is out of line of sight, it means it's probably not all the way forward in your deployment zone, unless it's in a ruin behind an opaque wall all the way forward in your deployment zone. And if you're planning to use this thing defensively, if you know that all of your D cannons are going to do is stay completely out of line of sight and just guard the midfield, then it is perfectly safe to deploy them in like ITC style play, where you have the opaque first walls of ruins, to deploy them as far forward as possible near your Farseer and some totally opaque first floor of a ruin where they're just going to sit for the whole game and have a 24-inch bubble of menace. That's fine. That is a perfectly solid way to use the D cannon. However, if you want the opportunity to get aggressive with the thing, which is the playstyle I'm about to talk about, you don't want it in the ruin, because probably you're going to have to go backwards to get the thing out, and that may just not be an option. You want it, therefore, to start behind the ruin with the obscuring keyword. Is it still a keyword character? I don't know. Ruins are obscuring. You need it out of line of sight. And that means starting a little bit further back, and support weapons in 10th edition only have a 3-inch move. So they have a 24-inch range and a 3-inch move. That's pretty limited. But the other way to think about playing with the D cannons is to start them in that like deterrent role, but then transition after the first turn in either turn 2 or maybe 3 into having them being actually these aggressive attack pieces that have moved into the midfield, just forward of your deployment zone, still out of line of sight, but like into the midfield such that they can reach into your opponent's deployment zone with that 24-inch range. And this I think is how they have been getting played by top players recently, for the simple reason that the Necron, ever since the Necron code, we got the balance data slate update, right? And I think I predicted in the data slate, when the day that the data slate came out, that Necrons could be the next big problem, and that seems to be happening. And I'm not like lots of people said it, but that seems to be where we are. And one of the units that has appeared in some first place undefeated Necron lists is the Monolith, which is this gargantuan, monstrous, difficult to eliminate, gigundous vehicle with a 2-up save. that doesn't necessarily have to like creep into the midfield. So it would maybe normally be out of range of your D cannons. So the problem with the monolith is something that has a 2-up save in cover against a bright lance still has a 4-up save if like some part of it is behind a ruin, which is pretty friggin' easy to do because the model's so big. So it's always going to have cover. And it doesn't have an invuln save, but it still saves against a bright lance on a 4-up, but a D cannon hits a little bit harder. Also, some people are trying to get Vipers into their lists all of a sudden for this reason, because if you can also strip cover, well, now you've got, that's amazing, because now something like the monolith is only going to save on a 6. Because something hit by a Viper weapon strips cover. I should have done a unit focus video on the Viper alongside of this one. I don't have a ton to say about it. It's really good to get plunging fire with it. You always put a bright lance on it. The stripping cover mechanic is kind of the reason to take it. It's definitely good enough for highly competitive play, but I think it's probably just barely overpriced relative to other stuff by 5 or 10 points. But the utility with the stripping cover, it's like you can use it well. So the challenge to playing effectively with D cannons, then, if you do want the option to play them aggressively, and look, there's nothing wrong with using them as deterrents, but the challenge to playing with them aggressively is to get them into position when they've only got a 3-inch move, because you don't want them to get caught flat-footed in line of sight of quick enemy units and then get blown away. So you look at what your opponent has and you ask yourself, is my opponent going to push into the mid? Does my opponent have to push into the midfield? Like something like a Tyrannid's army. You do not need to like get aggressive against Tyranids. Something against a Tyrannid's army, like a Tyrannid's army, will have to push into the midfield. You can hold your D cannons back. It's fine. But if your opponent can effectively hang back and in the early part of the game, then you need to get aggressive. Or if the thing that you really need to destroy in your opponent's list, like, it doesn't matter if there are targets that are moving into the midfield that you could shoot with your D cannons. Those aren't the things that they need to kill. If that's the case, if your D cannons have to be like fleet to get to the thing, you figure this out before you deploy. Look at what your opponent has, and you should be, even if you're not like some sort of veteran competitive autarch super genius, it's not too tough to like, well, work out, does my opponent have a bunch of aggressive units that don't have great range or are predominantly melee, or like a horde army that needs to flood objectives? Like, you know if your opponent is playing a very forward army. And you probably also know if there's something in that list that really needs to die that is predominantly a target for the D cannons. And if that is the case, you need to position them with an eye towards where you want them to be on turn 2 or 3. So you like figure out this piece of terrain just out of my deployment zone, they're going to be behind it, they're going to be safe there, and you set it up so on turn 1, let's say you're running 2 of them. One of them makes an advance move, and you have a nearby Farseer who's going to use a fate die to give it an advance move of 9 to get it where it needs to be. The other is going to make a normal move of 3 inches, and then it's going to shoot something because it has indirect fire. You should be able to. It doesn't really matter what you're shooting. And then you're going to use fire and fade to move again to get to where you need to be. That's 2 CP, so you also need an autarch in the list. But if you do it right and you set up well, you only need to do that once. Now you have a couple of support weapons in the midfield. If you have a 3rd support weapon, that one's going to make an advance roll too, and hopefully it's fine. Or maybe you hold one back initially and you move it with you advance it with the Farseer Fate die trick later when you need to. But essentially what you're doing with that playstyle is you're like creating a beachhead forward of your deployment zone for these like high threat weapons. And once they can reach all the way into your opponent's deployment zone, well, that just sucks for your opponent, because they have enough with the rerolls in particular, even with the natural inefficiencies with indirect fire, with the free cover and the -1 to hit. They're still putting out enough high power shots that there's nothing that doesn't have to worry, especially in combination with fate dice. This is, even with fewer fate dice, this is such an efficient, high powered weapon that it really benefits from the ability to cheat with fate dice. Oh, so if you're going to move them that way, you need to keep the Farseer close enough that you can keep keep using your low fate dice rolls for other stuff. The other thing to consider with the D-Cannon and the support weapons in general is that sometimes, if you're not careful, they can work at cross purposes with a bully unit like an Avatar of Cain or a big block of Wraithguard, for the simple reason that if your D-Cannons are positioned on the same part of the table as your Avatar of Cain, this can be especially an issue with Dawn of War deployment, where you're deploying along the long side of the table. So D-Cannons obviously do better when you're playing from the short end of the rectangle to some degree, because then you can, the 24-inch range can reach more of the midfield. But if you have your bully unit and your D-Cannons on the same part of the table, sometimes you can end up with a situation where the bully unit is like working effectively and pushing enemy targets away from the field of fire for the D-Cannons. So either you deploy the D-Cannons alongside or near that bully unit, but you're prepared to push forward with them, so it doesn't matter, or you use them in a different part of the table. And that is not going to be a new suggestion for veteran players, but it is sometimes something that a newer player could be caught off guard by, like, that's weird. I'm not getting any use out of this D-Cannon because my Avatar of Cain is, well, yeah, you have to plan for that. Also, obviously, if you do want the option to get aggressive with your D-Cannons before the game, when you're looking at your list, you have to make sure that there's nothing else that needs those resources on turn one. So, like the Fire and Fade thing, if you want to do that, you need to not need that 2CP elsewhere. So that, I think, really is the most efficient way to use the support weapons competitively, is 1 to 3 of them, D-Cannons, before the game. Figure out what your opponent's going to do, what are the ideal targets, either hang back and punish your opponent for moving into the midfield, or get aggressive with them by advancing with fate dice and possibly also with Fire and Fade, and then lighting stuff up on turn 2 or 3. And before you shoot, you just work out, am I going to use the fate die on pushing through some devastating wounds on something with an invuln, or am I going to max 8 damage? And just plan it. You obviously need to decide where you need your fate dice before the phase begins. And that can just be an incredibly potent, powerful combination that will have play into any list, any opponent. There will never be a matchup in which your D-Cannons just aren't doing work for you. The blast keyword is just great on the D-Cannon. It just gives it that like extra little bit of diversity that really helps. And don't forget that if you do shoot an infantry unit with it, it's suppressed. So now it has -1 to hit, which actually can be pretty good against something like a big unit of CSM Terminators, although we're not seeing a ton of those these days, or like in a mirror match, like 10 Wraithguard. Wraithguard do not want to be shot with D-Cannons, so you should shoot them with D-Cannons. Actually, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the D-Cannon is one of like the single best tools in a mirror match, because even the Avatar of Cain with damage reduction does not want to get shot by 3 D-Cannons from out of line of sight, not at all. And they obviously have really good synergy with the Yin Karn. Okay, so let's talk about the other loadouts for you Donatello-loving contrarians. Between the Shadow Weaver and the Vibro Cannon, the Shadow Weaver is obviously the better pick. It's got a 48-inch range instead of a 24-inch range, so that's really the big advantage. You don't need to move it to reach into your opponent's backfield from turn 1. It has D6 plus 2 shots, hitting on 3s, strength 6, no AP, 1 damage, blast great into little horde units. It has devastating wounds. It also has the heavy keyword, and it also has indirect fire. And it's likely to make better use of the suppression ability for the simple reason that it wants to target infantry, unlike the D-Cannon, which will only shoot infantry. Usually, it will only shoot infantry if it can't shoot anything else, unless, of course, it's like super heavy infantry like Terminators. Now, the Shadow Weaver is very good. D6 plus 2 shots with 1 reroll to hit and 1 reroll to wound with the heavy keyword, so +1 to hit if you don't move, and you don't need to move with the 48-inch range, is just really solid. It particularly excels into enemies that don't have particularly good armor, but are kind of tough and have infantry units that they need to do stuff. It's really good at killing like orc infantry or a heavy weapons team that is not in fact wearing power armor. And one of the most common uses for the Shadow Weaver is just to eliminate enemies on objectives. So plenty of armies have some cheap chaff unit that hangs out in the backfield and controls an objective, whether it's cheapo, CSM, cultists, or Nurglings or whatever. And Shadow Weavers are really good at picking that stuff up. And there's kind of nothing your opponent can do about it, which is great. They're also really good into characters that rely on staying out of line of sight because they're not part of a unit, and like invuln saves. So something like Eldred or like a Farseer actually hates the Shadow Weaver, because a Farseer, toughness 3, it's going to get wounded with most of those shots, and then the armor save, the 4-up invuln, is not good against volume of fire, which the Shadow Weaver sort of has. So there might be certain meta picks where the Shadow Weaver has some play. What I don't like about it really is that, the Night Spinner is more expensive at 180 points, but the ability to do 2 damage with Devastating Wounds instead of 1 damage with Devastating Wounds, and also that monofilament web that the Night Spinner has for movement control, that's really good. And the ability to be able to threaten all kinds of infantry instead of just light infantry is pretty significant. And also because of the 2 damage, it's good against light vehicles. It's not so much that the Shadow Weaver's bad. It's just, it's probably overpriced by 20 points at 125. I just think you're probably better off spending some more points and getting a Night Spinner. But if you want to use it, you definitely can, and the 48-inch range is good. The Vibro Cannon is just, it's trash. It is a 48-inch range, the heavy keyword, D6 shots, which is cool, hits on 3s. Strength 8, great, -1 AP, flat 2 damage, only -1 AP. It's it wants to be a Marine killer. The big problem the Vibro Cannon faces, it doesn't have the indirect fire. The big problem the Vibro Cannon faces is that D6 shots is better than D3, but it doesn't have blast. So the D cannon is better at killing Marines. There just really aren't many targets that the Vibro Cannon is going to be better into, and you can only use it if you have it hanging out in the open. And it's just not that hard to destroy. So in a matchup in which it's actually a problem for your opponent will simply kill it. And in a matchup where it is not a problem for your opponent, you should have spent the 125 points on something else. In previous editions of the game, there have been advantages to shooting the same target with multiple Vibro Cannons. It starts to vibrate with some particular frequency, and it has this sort of neat lore effect also. And at this point in 10th edition, I feel like we only even got rules for it because model is in the kit. It almost feels like it wants to have gone to Legends. But if you absolutely have to use your Vibro Cannon, make use of the 48-inch range, keep it in your deployment zone with cover positions such that nothing with the range to target it can actually get a bead on it, but it has some sort of command of certain firing lanes in the midfield, and it has just enough strength and just enough damage that it can be a deterrent. Well, not a deterrent. It can do some damage to heavy infantry and vehicles. If you have some support weapons built that way, and for some crazy reason you glued because here's the other cool thing about the support weapon kit. It's the only Eldar kit where you can, without any magnetizing, without anything at all, you can just switch the weapons out. If you haven't bought any of these things, just so you know, this is really cool. It's snap fit. You can, I don't think they meant to, I would love to believe they meant to do this because I wish GW would do more of this, but you can just pop the Shadow Weaver off and pop the D cannon on and put the Vibro Cannon on, and no glue, no magnets. It's great. So I guess if you were playing a real casual game and you wanted to use your Vibro Cannons, that's how you would do it. Okay, so that's what I've got. Support weapons were great in 9th edition. They're still good in 10th edition. The only reason we haven't really seen them is that we've had so much stuff that was better. But as various units have been nerfed and the cost of other target elimination units has gone up, support weapons have gotten a lot more attractive, combined with the fact that they play well into the Necron meta. I think it's a good time to reconsider the role of support weapons in a list. Their track record at recent GTs demonstrates that objectively they have a lot of play. Okay, that's what I've got. Hope to be back again soon with new content. I know in my last unit focus video, I said that I thought this week was going to be the introduction to competitive Aeldari for newer players, with a big rundown of how to build lists and everything else. And to be honest, I just couldn't pull it off between work being extra busy and two little kiddos. That turned out to be too ambitious, but that is currently my top priority for a longer, more ambitious video, and I will get to it as soon as I can. Until then, if you've not clicked like, I hope that you will click like. If you have not subscribed, I hope you will subscribe. And I have to do it because I always do it. I'm going to plug the Patreon. I really appreciate my patrons. Their $3 a month makes a big difference to me, and also I enjoy chatting with them all over on Discord. They also get early access to some content and the ability to consume some content like a podcast by downloading the audio. Okay, bye everyone. Good luck with your pointy ears. Take care. Bye.